The alarm clock rang at 5 a.m. like every day. Sarah Miller stretched her arm automatically to silence it before it woke Emma in the room next door. She sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her eyes still heavy with sleep, and contemplated the small two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, New York, that they had called home for almost 10 years. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and organized, each object in its proper place, each corner immaculate, a reflection of Sarah's methodical personality. The walls displayed photographs of Emma at different ages, her first day at school, birthdays, trips to the beach. In none of them was there the presence of a father. Sarah went to the kitchen and prepared coffee, moving with the precision of someone who follows the same routine for years. At 38, she still maintained the beauty that drew attention in her youth, though now it was of a different kind, more serene, marked by expression lines that told stories of silent struggles and discreet victories. "Good morning, Mom," Emma's voice interrupted her thoughts. The 15-year-old teenager was already dressed in her school uniform, her curly hair tied in a high ponytail, her brown eyes lively and intelligent like her mother's. "Good morning, sweetie," replied Sarah, serving a cup of coffee with milk for her daughter. "Did you sleep well?" Emma nodded, sitting at the small kitchen table. "Today's the big day, isn't it?" she asked, closely observing her mother. "The interview at the millionaire's house." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to control the nervousness growing in her chest. "Yes, it is. And I can't believe I made it to the final stage of the process." The position of caregiver for Michael Anderson's twin daughters was competitive and well paid. The advertisement published by his secretary clearly stated, "Seeking caregiver for two 10-year-old girls with special needs. Nursing experience, patience, and willingness to live on site are essential requirements." The salary offered was 3 times what Sarah currently earned as a nurse at the local health clinic. "You'll get it," Emma stated with conviction, biting into a piece of toast. "No one has more experience than you with special needs children." Sarah smiled, grateful for her daughter's unwavering confidence. It was true. Her years working in the pediatric ward of a public hospital had given her vast experience with children facing all kinds of challenges. But what the candidate didn't know was that these specific girls had driven away 5 caregivers in the last 6 months. Mr. Anderson's secretary had been discreet, but Sarah had managed to extract some information from the employment agency. The twins were difficult, closed off, sometimes even hostile. "The problem is that if I get the job, we'll have to move," Sarah reminded her, the concern evident in her voice. "How do you feel about that? Changing schools, leaving your friends, our routine?" Emma shrugged, a surprising maturity for someone so young showing in her gaze. "Mum, you've been working 2 jobs for years to give me the basics. If this is a chance for you to work in just one place and earn better, I won't be the one to stop you." Sarah felt her eyes water. Her daughter had grown up too fast, forced by circumstances to develop an understanding of life that many adults didn't possess. "Besides," Emma continued with a mischievous smile, "they say the house has a private library, a swimming pool, and an incredible view of the ocean. Try not to tell me the disadvantages." They laughed together, sharing that moment of lightness before separating for the day. Emma to school, where she maintained the best grades in the class and already spoke with conviction about her desire to study law. Sarah to an interview that could completely change the course of their lives. The Anderson mansion was exactly as Sarah had imagined. An imposing construction in colonial style, meticulously preserved on a hill in Newport Road Island. The perfectly maintained gardens boasted an impressive variety of flowers, and the view of the Atlantic Ocean was breathtaking. Sarah, in her best blazer and dress pants, felt tiny in front of that symbol of power and wealth. A uniformed maid opened the electronic gate and led her along a stone path to the entrance of the mansion. "Mrs. Johnson is waiting," informed the woman, referring to Michael Anderson's personal secretary, who had conducted all previous interviews. Sarah was guided through an entrance hall decorated with works of art and antiques that seemed to be worth more than everything she owned. The house, despite being impeccably clean and decorated, had a strangely cold atmosphere, as if it lacked the human touch that transforms a residence into a home. In the living room, a middle-aged woman with impeccably arranged grey hair in a bun and a grey-tailored suit waited with a clipboard in her hands. "Mrs. Miller, punctual. I appreciate that," said Mrs. Johnson, without smiling, indicating that Sarah should sit in a leather armchair. The interview began as expected. Questions about qualifications, professional experience, references. Sarah answered confidently, highlighting her years as a pediatric nurse and her experience with special needs children. Everything was going well until Mrs. Johnson came to the personal questions. "I see here that you are a single mother," she observed, looking at the file. "Is your daughter's father present in her life?" Sarah felt a knot form in her throat. The lie she had maintained for years came out automatically. "My husband died when Emma was 5 years old. An accident." It was easier that way. Cleaner. Better than saying that Robert Miller was in prison for involvement in corruption and money laundering schemes. Better than telling that he had abandoned her pregnant when he was caught, leaving her to face not only the pregnancy alone, but also the stigma of being a criminal's wife. "I'm sorry," said Mrs. Johnson, without showing real empathy. "And how did your daughter handle that loss?" "Emma is an extraordinary girl," replied Sarah, a genuine smile appearing as she spoke of her daughter. "Strong, determined, with an incredible ability to see the good side of things, even in the most difficult situations. She's my pride." Something in the way Sarah spoke seemed to touch Mrs. Johnson, who slightly relaxed her formal posture. "Mr. Anderson mentioned that you could bring your daughter to live here. If selected, the caregiver's accommodations include an additional suite. I believe it would be comfortable for both of you." "That would be perfect," agreed Sarah, feeling a flash of hope. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of wheels on the wooden floor. Sarah turned to see a girl of approximately 10 years old in a motorized wheelchair stopped at the door of the room. She had blonde hair tied in a loose braid and intense green eyes that observed Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. "Lily, shouldn't you be in your piano lesson?" asked Mrs. Johnson, visibly uncomfortable with the interruption. "Cancelled. Paul is sick," replied the girl without taking her eyes off Sarah. "Is she the new nanny? The one they're going to hire to pretend she cares for a few weeks before giving up like all the others?" The coldness in such a young voice caught Sarah by surprise. Before Mrs. Johnson could reprimand the child, she stood up and walked over to the girl, bending down to be at eye level. "My name is Sarah," she introduced herself with a calm smile. "I'm not exactly a nanny, I'm a nurse, and if your father hires me, I'll be here to help you and your sister in whatever you need. And no, I don't intend to give up." Lily stared at her for a few seconds, her face a mask of studied indifference. "Everyone gives up," she finally declared. "Mom gave up, Dad gave up on life, the nannies give up. It's just a matter of time." Before Sarah could respond, the girl spun her chair and disappeared down the corridor, leaving behind a heavy silence. "I apologize for Lily's behavior," said Mrs. Johnson after a moment. "The girls have been facing difficulties since their mother passed away." "How long ago did that happen?" asked Sarah. 3 years ago. A car accident. Jessica, Mr. Anderson's wife, was driving when a drunk driver invaded the lane. She died instantly." Sarah nodded, feeling immediate compassion for the children. Losing a mother at that age, she knew well the impact it could have. And the girls, were they born with the condition that limits them to wheelchairs? Yes, a congenital malformation of the spine. Lily and Madison never walked, Mr. Anderson has invested in research, experimental treatments abroad, but so far without significant success. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Mrs. Johnson explaining in detail the responsibilities of the position. In addition to physical care, helping with transfers from the chair, supervising daily physical therapy, monitoring medications, it would be necessary to accompany the girls to medical appointments, private lessons, and various therapies. Mr. Anderson is frequently traveling. His network of clinics requires constant attention. When he's in town, he usually works late and has social commitments on weekends. In essence, you would be the primary adult presence in the girls' lives, explained Mrs. Johnson. At the end of the interview, Sarah had mixed feelings. On one hand, the salary and material conditions were incomparable. On the other, there was something deeply sad about that luxurious house and the children who inhabited it, something that went beyond physical disability or the loss of their mother. Mr. Anderson would like to speak with you personally before making the final decision, informed Mrs. Johnson, leading her back to the entrance hall. Normally, he doesn't participate in the selection process, but let's say the case of the twins requires special care. Can you return tomorrow at 6 p.m.? He has reserved time in his schedule. Sarah agreed, a mixture of nervousness and hope growing in her chest as she left the mansion. Upon reaching the gate, she turned to look at the imposing building again. For an instant, she had the impression of seeing a child's face in the second-floor window, a girl identical to Lily observing from a partially open curtain. Madison, the other twin, who hadn't appeared during the interview, the one who, according to whispers from the employment agency, was even more difficult than her sister. Michael Anderson observed the city of Boston through the panoramic window of his office on the 30th floor of a commercial building in the financial district. At 42, he was considered one of the most successful businessmen of the new generation. His network of orthopedic clinics, started with a modest inheritance and expanded with impeccable strategic vision, now had units in 5 states. Tall, with a physique that still maintained the discipline from the times he practiced competitive swimming, black hair already sprinkled with grey at the temples, and eyes of a deep green, the same ones his daughters had inherited. Michael was frequently cited in business magazines and social columns. Since Jessica's death, however, his public appearances had been strictly limited to what was necessary to maintain the company's image. "Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Johnson is on the line," announced his assistant. Through the intercom, Michael promptly answered, "Yes, Mrs. Johnson. I interviewed the candidate, Sarah Miller, today. I believe we have finally found someone suitable for the girls." Michael sighed, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of fatigue. "You said the same about the last 3, Mrs. Johnson. This one is different. She has vast experience with special needs children, seems genuinely vocational for caregiving. And Lily tested her, as she does with everyone. She didn't get intimidated." That captured Michael's attention. His older daughter, by mere 4 minutes, as she always made a point of reminding, had developed an almost supernatural ability to drive people away. Her cutting words and challenging gaze had reduced more than one experienced professional to tears. What did Lily say to her? The usual, that everyone gives up, including you, who gave up on life. Michael closed his eyes, the familiar pain tightening his chest. It was true, in a way. After Jessica's death, he had plunged into work like a man drowning in the sea, desperately without looking back, seeking not salvation but oblivion. His daughters, who already faced significant physical limitations, now also dealt with an emotionally absent father. And how did she react? Calmly. She didn't take offense, didn't try to force an instant connection, but also didn't back down. There's something about her, Mr. Anderson, a resilience that seems compatible with what the girls need. Michael reflected for a moment, After so many failed attempts, there was something in Mrs. Johnson's tone that suggested a glimmer of hope. "I'll meet her tomorrow, then. Reserve an hour in my schedule at the end of the day." "I've already done so, sir. At 6 p.m. After hanging up, Michael turned back to the window. The sun was beginning to set over the city, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, a beauty he could barely appreciate in recent years. At some point, he had lost the ability to see beauty in the world. It was as if everything was covered by a grey veil since that rainy night when he received the fatal call. "Mr. Anderson, there's been an accident." What tormented him the most were not just the memories of Jessica, her smile, her smell, the way she played piano on Sunday nights, but the awareness that they were arguing when she drove off in the rain. An argument about the girls, about how much time he spent away from home, about the fact that his daughters needed a present father, not just a distant provider. The last words he said to her were harsh, accusatory. He never had the chance to apologize, to tell her how much he loved her despite their differences, to thank her for being the extraordinary mother she had been to two girls, with needs that many would have considered a burden. Since then, guilt had been his constant companion. Guilt for not being more present. Guilt for not being the husband Jessica deserved. Guilt for now not being able to be the father his daughters needed. It was easier to immerse himself in work, to delegate daily care to competent professionals, to send money for research that might one day allow his daughters to walk. Easier, yes, but the price was too high. The girls were becoming strangers to him. Lily increasingly aggressive and rebellious, Madison progressively more reclusive and silent. With each nanny or caregiver who gave up, he felt that he lost a little more of the battle to keep his family together. Or what remained of it. "Mr. Anderson," his assistant's voice through the intercom pulled him from his somber thoughts. "Your video conference with the Japanese investors starts in 5 minutes. "Thank you, Anna. I'll be ready." Michael adjusted his tie, once again assuming the mask of the confident and successful businessman that everyone expected to see. No one in that virtual room would imagine that, behind that perfectly composed facade, was a man struggling not to drown in remorse and uncertainty. Emma was anxiously waiting in the small living room of the apartment when Sarah finally arrived. The teenager jumped from the sofa, her eyes shining with expectation. "So, how was it?" Sarah smiled, leaving her bag on the table and taking off the shoes that pinched her feet after such a long day. "It was interesting," she replied thoughtfully. "The house is impressive, as we expected. The job seems challenging, but within my capabilities. I met one of the girls, Lily. She is intense." "Intense how?" asked Emma, following her mother to the kitchen where Sarah began to prepare tea. "Like someone who has suffered too many losses for her age and built walls around herself," explained Sarah, recalling the girl's challenging look. "She and her sister lost their mother 3 years ago in a car accident. The father is present physically, or at least financially, but emotionally absent, from what I could tell." Emma contemplated this thoughtfully. "Sounds like they really need you then." Sarah smiled at her daughter's perceptive observation. "Maybe. Tomorrow I'll meet their father, Michael Anderson. The final decision will be his." "You'll get it," Emma stated with conviction. "No one is better at breaking down emotional walls than you, Mum." Sarah hugged her daughter, grateful for her unconditional support. She didn't tell Emma about the knot she had felt in her stomach when lying once again about Robert's death, nor about the unsettling sensation she had had when perceiving the deep sadness that permeated that sumptuous mansion. That night, lying in her simple bed, Sarah couldn't sleep. She thought about the twins in wheelchairs, their green eyes full of distrust, the absence of childlike joy in such a materially privileged environment. She thought about Emma, who had grown up with so little, but whose laughter still frequently echoed through the small apartment. She thought about herself, the choices she had made, the lies she maintained, the life she had built from the ashes of a disastrous relationship. And finally, she thought about Michael Anderson, the man she would meet the next day, a millionaire tormented by guilt, from what she could deduce. A man who, despite all the resources at his disposal, seemed unable to offer his daughters what they needed most: presence, connection, unconditional love. Ironically, these were exactly the riches that Sarah possessed in abundance, despite her bank account almost always in the red. What would his eyes be like, she wondered, imagining the twins' father? Would they be cold and calculating, as she would expect from a successful businessman? Or would they carry that same deep sadness she had seen in Lily's gaze? Tomorrow she would find out, and somehow felt that this meeting would change the course of her life forever. The lights in Michael Anderson's office were on late that night. He reviewed reports, signed documents, made notes for future meetings, all to keep his mind occupied, to not think about the emptiness that awaited him at home. At one point, he opened his desk drawer and removed a framed photograph that he kept hidden there. The photograph showed Jessica sitting on a garden bench with Lily and Madison in their small adapted chairs, all smiling under the golden light of a summer afternoon. A perfect moment frozen in time prior to all the tragedies. Michael ran his fingers over the image, an almost reverent gesture. "I miss you so much," he whispered to the wife, who could no longer hear him. "And I'm so sorry I'm failing them." On the other side of the city in her modest apartment, Sarah finally fell asleep without imagining that miles away, the man who would soon enter her life was contemplating the same moon through a much more luxurious but equally lonely window. Two different worlds about to collide. The clock marked 5:55 p.m. when Sarah crossed the Anderson mansion gate again. She was impeccably dressed in a simple but elegant dress that she saved for special occasions, one of the few luxuries she allowed herself. This time it was Mrs. Johnson herself who received her at the door. "Mr. Anderson awaits you in his office," she informed, leading her through a different corridor than the day before, towards an area of the house that Sarah had not yet seen. The office occupied the entire extension of the east wing of the mansion, a spacious area with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, an imposing dark wood desk, and windows that offered a privileged view of the bay. On the walls, besides framed diplomas and certificates, there were photographs of Michael at medical congresses, clinic inaugurations, and a few family images. Michael was with his back turned when she entered, observing the sunset through the window. Upon hearing the door open, he turned slowly. Sarah felt a slight jolt when she first looked at him. In the newspapers and magazines where he occasionally appeared, Michael Anderson seemed distant, almost inaccessible in his perfection as a successful businessman. In person, however, what drew the most attention were his eyes, of an intense green like those of his daughters, but carrying a sadness that no photograph had managed to capture. "Mrs. Miller," he greeted her formally, approaching for a handshake. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." His touch was brief, professional, but Sarah couldn't help but notice the tension in his shoulders, as if he carried an invisible weight. Mrs. Johnson spoke very highly of your resume and your interview, he began, sitting across from her in an armchair instead of behind the desk, a gesture that slightly reduced the formality between them. "But I need to be frank. My daughters are not simple cases." Sarah nodded, maintaining eye contact. "Children rarely are, Mr. Anderson, especially when they've been through trauma. I met Lily yesterday, and, although briefly, I could see that she has built considerable emotional defenses." Michael seemed momentarily surprised by her frankness. "Lily is the more vocal about her feelings," he admitted. "Madison, on the other hand, has barely spoken since her mother's death. She has withdrawn more and more. The therapists say it's a form of grief, a defense mechanism, but his voice faltered slightly, and he cleared his throat to disguise it. I understand your concern, said Sarah gently. You've seen other caregivers give up, and that only reinforces for the girls the idea that people always leave. Michael stared at her, a shadow of vulnerability crossing his normally controlled gaze. Exactly. And I can't allow that to happen again. I need someone who understands that this is not just a job with a good salary. It's a responsibility to two children who have already lost too much. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. For a moment, she considered saying what she thought he wanted to hear, promises of unwavering dedication, declarations of vocation. But she opted for honesty. Mr. Anderson, I can't promise that there will never be conflicts or difficult moments. What I can guarantee is that I won't abandon your daughters at the first sign of difficulty. I'm a single mother. I raised my daughter alone since she was 5 years old. I know what it's like to face storms without giving up. Michael observed her carefully, as if trying to see beyond her words. Mrs. Johnson mentioned that you have a teenage daughter, Emma, correct? How does she feel about moving? Here? Emma is extraordinarily understanding for her age, replied Sarah, a soft smile lighting up her face as she spoke of her daughter. She understands that this is an important opportunity for us. Besides, I believe she could be a positive influence for Lily and Madison. Michael seemed to consider this possibility for a moment. An older sister, he murmured almost to himself. Then, with a sigh, he rose and walked to the window again. There's something I need to show you before we make a final decision. He headed to a side door that Sarah had not noticed before. Upon opening it, a smaller room was revealed, designed as a small private theatre. In the center, a large screen displayed paused images of what appeared to be a home video. This is a recording of the girl's birthday 2 years ago, explained Michael, inviting her to sit. 1 year after Jessica's death. I want you to see how they were and how they've become. He activated the remote control, and the images came to life on the screen. 2 8-year-old girls in wheelchairs decorated with balloons were blowing out candles on an elaborate cake. Their expressions, however, were devoid of any joy. In the background, uniformed employees and a few children, probably colleagues' kids, watched uncomfortably. Michael appeared briefly, trying to cheer up his daughters, but his smile was clearly forced. The scene changed to the opening of presents. Lily tore open the wrappings mechanically, while Madison simply looked at her own lap, completely ignoring the colorful packages in front of her. I did everything wrong, confessed Michael, his voice almost a whisper. I thought a big party, expensive gifts, a spectacular cake, that all of this could compensate for their mother's absence. It was a disaster. Sarah watched the images with a heavy heart, recognizing in the girl's eyes a familiar pain, the same she had seen in Emma when she was small and asked about her father. You were trying to help them the only way you knew how, she offered gently. Michael shook his head, turning off the video. I was trying to alleviate my own guilt, he corrected bitterly. Jessica and I were arguing when she left that night. I said terrible things. I accused her of exaggerating the girl's needs, of being overprotective, said she was raising 2 emotional dependents instead of 2 strong young women. He ran his hand over his face, a gesture that revealed more vulnerability than he probably intended to. Show. She was right, of course. She always was. I was so busy building an empire, pursuing miraculous treatments abroad, that I didn't see what was right in front of me. 2 girls who simply needed a present father. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. There was a raw honesty in his words, an admission of failures that contrasted with the polished image of the successful businessman. Mr. Anderson, we all make mistakes as parents, said Sarah softly. The important thing is that you realize it now, and are trying to change. Michael laughed without humor. Hiring someone to take care of them while I continue immersed in work can hardly be considered a genuine change. Sarah surprised herself with her own boldness when she replied, "It depends. If you're hiring me to replace you in their lives, then no. But if you see me as an ally, to reconnect you with your daughters, to help you rebuild that relationship, then perhaps it's the first step of a true change." Their gazes met for a long moment. There was something in Michael's look, surprise, perhaps even a slight glimpse of hope, that made Sarah feel she had touched on a crucial point. "You're not like the other candidates," he observed finally. "No, I'm not," agreed Sarah, "because I'm not here just for a salary. I genuinely believe I can make a difference for Lily and Madison. And for you too, if you'll allow me." Michael stood up abruptly, as if that last phrase had destabilized him. "The job is yours, Mrs. Miller," he decided, returning to his previous formality. "Mrs. Johnson will take care of the contractual details. When could you start?" "I would need a few days to organize the move and communicate with Emma's school," replied Sarah, still processing the sudden change in his posture. "Of course, a week would be sufficient." Sarah nodded, standing up as well. "Perfect. And Mr. Anderson?" She hesitated before continuing. "Thank you for the trust. I promise to do my best for your daughters." Michael merely nodded, his face again a mask of emotional control. But when they said goodbye with another brief handshake, Sarah had the impression that for a fleeting instant he squeezed her fingers a little harder than strictly necessary. It was as if, silently, he was begging her not to give up, not just on the girls, but on him too. The following week passed in a whirlwind of activities. Sarah gave notice at her 2 jobs, spoke with the administration of Emma's school about the transfer, and began packing the belongings of the small apartment they had called home for so long. Mrs. Johnson called daily with updates about the contract, information about the girls' routine, and questions about food preferences and specific needs for the room they would occupy. On the night before the move, Sarah found Emma sitting on the empty bed, looking at the now bare walls of her room. "Everything okay, sweetie?" she asked, sitting beside her daughter. Emma shrugged, a gesture that tried to seem unconcerned but couldn't completely hide her apprehension. "Just thinking, will we adapt there? I mean, it's such a different world from ours." Sarah put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Different, yes, but also an opportunity. Think of the twins. They need someone who understands them, who helps them deal with their losses. And you, with all your sensitivity and strength, might be exactly what they need, like a kind of older sister." Emma smiled weakly. "And this Michael Anderson, what's he like?" Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words to describe the complex man she had met. "He's a man marked by guilt and grief, successful professionally, but lost as a father. I think deep down he's just as scared as his daughters." "Seems like you understood a lot about him in just one conversation," observed Emma, with the insight that always surprised Sarah. "Maybe because—" Sarah paused, reflecting. "Maybe I recognize his pain. It's different from ours, of course, but it's still pain." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Mom, do you think you'll ever tell me the truth about my father?" The question caught Sarah completely by surprise. She felt her blood freeze in her veins while her heart raced. What do you mean?" she stammered, struggling to maintain her composure. Emma stared at her with an intensity that seemed far beyond her 15 years. "I know there's something you're not telling me. I've always known. The way you avoid talking about him, how you change the subject when I ask details about the accident, how we never have photos of him around the house." Sarah felt the world spin around her. Years building a lie to protect her daughter, and now, on the eve of a move that could transform their lives, that time bomb threatened to explode. "Emma, she began, not knowing how to continue. "You don't need to tell me now," interrupted the teenager, holding her mother's hand. "I just want you to know that when you're ready, I'll be here. And Nothing, absolutely nothing you say will change how I feel about you, or how grateful I am for everything you've done for me." Tears flowed freely down Sarah's face. She pulled her daughter into a tight hug, amazed by the wisdom and understanding of that extraordinary being she had raised. "I love you so much," she whispered between sobs, "more than anything in this life." "I know, Mum," replied Emma, hugging her back with equal force. "I know." That night, Sarah could barely sleep. Emma's words echoed in her mind, mixing with images of Michael's sad gaze, Lily's challenging eyes, Madison's enigmatic silence. She was about to dive into a completely new world, carrying with her a secret that she might no longer be able to hide. The arrival at the Anderson mansion the following morning was less formal than Sarah had expected. Michael was on a business trip, something that Mrs. Johnson had mentioned casually, as if it were perfectly normal for him to be absent on the day the new residents arrived. Sarah and Emma's suitcases seemed tiny in the huge entrance hall. A butler helped carry them upstairs to a reserved wing on the second floor. "These will be your quarters," explained Mrs. Johnson, opening the door to a spacious suite with 2 large beds, a private bathroom, and a small living area. "The girls are in the main corridor, 5 doors ahead. Each has her own room, but they prefer to stay together in Lily's most of the time." Emma looked around with wide eyes, clearly impressed with the discreet luxury of the environment. "It's bigger than our entire apartment," she murmured to her mother, who felt equally impressed. Mrs. Johnson continued with the practical instructions. Wi-Fi password, meal times, emergency numbers, location of medical equipment for the twins. Everything was meticulously organized, almost like in a luxury hospital. "The girls are in music class now with Professor Paul. It ends in—" she checked her wristwatch, "approximately 20 minutes. I suggest you settle in and then go meet them, or rather for you to meet them again," she added, addressing Sarah, "and for Emma to meet them." When Mrs. Johnson left, Sarah sat on the edge of one of the beds, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the change in their lives. "Mum, are you okay?" asked Emma, sitting beside her. "Yes, just absorbing all of this." Emma smiled, squeezing her hand. "We'll manage. We always do, don't we?" Sarah sensed this, grateful for the strength that her daughter always provided in moments of doubt. After quickly organizing their belongings, they headed to the music room on the ground floor. As they approached, they heard the hesitant notes of a piano, occasionally interrupted by a gentle male voice offering guidance. Sarah knocked lightly on the partially open door before entering. The room was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave onto the garden. A grand piano occupied the center of the space, and beside it were positioned 2 wheelchairs. A middle-aged man with graying hair was bent over the instrument, adjusting one of the girl's hands on the keys. "Excuse me," said Sarah softly. "I'm Sarah, the new caregiver, and this is my daughter, Emma." The teacher straightened up, smiling amicably. "Paul Taylor, music teacher, welcome. We were just finishing for today." Lily turned her chair immediately, facing the newcomers with the same challenging look that Sarah had met in the interview. Next to her, physically almost identical, but with a much more withdrawn expression, was Madison. "You really came back," observed Lily, the surprise barely disguised in her voice. "I thought you had changed your mind." "I said I wouldn't give up easily," replied Sarah with a calm smile. "And this is my daughter Emma." Emma stepped forward, smiling genuinely at the twins. "Hi, I'm very happy to meet you. Your house is amazing." Lily studied Emma with barely disguised interest. "How old are you?" 15, replied Emma. "And you don't mind having moved to take care of 2 cripples," continued Lily, the tone deliberately provocative. "Lily," reprimanded the teacher, visibly shocked. Emma, however, was not shaken. "First, I would never use that word. Second, I didn't come to take care of you. I came to live here with my mum, who is the one who will work with you. And third, from the little I've seen, you seem perfectly capable of several things. That Chopin you were playing just now? I could never do it. A surprised silence followed her. Words. Even Madison, who had not raised her eyes since their arrival, briefly looked at Emma. It was Mozart, not Chopin, corrected Lily, but her tone had lost some of the initial hostility. Well, that only proves how much I know about classical music, laughed Emma, further disarming the situation with her naturalness. Professor Paul took advantage of the moment to say goodbye, promising to return the following week. When he left, an uncomfortable silence hung over the room. It was Sarah who broke it. "What do you usually do after music lessons?" Lily shrugged. "Nothing specific. Sometimes we go to the library or watch TV in the living room." "Can I see the library?" asked Emma, her eyes shining with genuine interest. "I love books. I'm reading Brave New World for a school project right now." "Have you read Animal Farm?" asked Lily, a flash of enthusiasm crossing her normally defensive gaze. "Yes, it's one of my favorites." "Mine too," replied Lily, almost smiling. "Madison prefers Jane Austen and those romantic things, but I like political dystopias." Madison shot a quick glance at her sister, the first sign of communication Sarah had observed between them. "Can we go to the library now?" suggested Emma. "You can show me your favorite books." To Sarah's surprise, Lily nodded, turning her chair toward the door. "Come on, it's across the hall." Emma shot a quick look at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. As the two teenagers left, Sarah noticed that Madison remained motionless, hesitant. With an intuition born of years dealing with traumatized children, Sarah knelt down to be at eye level with the girl. "Do you want to go too, Madison? I promise I'll stay nearby if you prefer." To her surprise, the silent girl nodded, almost imperceptibly. Sarah resisted the urge to express her satisfaction exaggeratedly, fearing it might make the child retreat. Instead, she simply smiled and walked alongside the wheelchair as Madison slowly moved it toward the library. It was the first of many small miracles that would happen in that house. That same night, miles away, in a cell at the maximum security penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, Robert Miller received an envelope through a corrupt guard. Inside was a recent photograph of Sarah and Emma entering the Anderson mansion. A cold smile formed on his lips as he studied the image. "Finally," he murmured to himself. "Looks like luck is changing, my dear Sarah." He carefully stored the photograph under the thin mattress. His escape plan was almost complete, and now, thanks to Sarah's new position, he had a clear objective for when he was free: the Anderson mansion and the two little heiresses to a fortune that could finance his permanent disappearance. What he didn't know was that, in the same mansion, while Sarah was helping the twins prepare for bed and Emma was arranging her books on the shelf in the new room, an imported car was silently entering through the gates. Michael Anderson had returned from his trip earlier than expected. From the window of his office, he observed the lights on in his daughter's room, a rare phenomenon in recent weeks, and, for a brief moment, allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. 3 months passed since the move to the Anderson mansion. What had begun as a purely professional arrangement had transformed into something none of them could have predicted. The house, once silent and heavy, now reverberated with the sounds of renewed life. The laughter of the twins, almost forgotten in the years after their mother's death, echoed through the corridors again. Even Madison, who had remained in self-imposed silence for so long, was beginning to speak again. Not much. Just whispered words, mainly to Emma, but it was already a miracle in itself. That Saturday morning, Sarah was observing from the veranda while Emma pushed Lily and Madison's chairs through the garden, showing them how to identify different species of butterflies. Her daughter had revealed herself to be a transformative force in the twins' lives, bringing youth and joy where before there was only isolation and bitterness. "It's almost like magic, isn't it?" Michael's voice arose behind her, making her turn with a slight start. In the last few months, a subtle metamorphosis had also occurred in the mansion's owner. Although he still worked long hours, Michael now made a point of dining with his daughters almost every night. On weekends, he had cancelled social commitments to spend time with them. The previous week, for the first time in years, he had personally attended a school presentation by the girls, instead of sending Mrs. Johnson in his place. "Emma has a gift," replied Sarah, smiling as she observed the three teenagers interacting as if they were real sisters. "It's not just Emma," corrected Michael, approaching to stand beside her on the veranda. "It's you too, Sarah. You've changed this house, changed my daughters, changed—" He hesitated, and Sarah felt that familiar tension in the air, an unacknowledged connection that grew every day, despite both their attempts to keep it strictly professional. "All children just need genuine love and constant presence," she replied, subtly deviating from the dangerous path the conversation could take. "Lily and Madison are extraordinary. They always were. They just needed someone who could see beyond the wheelchairs, beyond the tragedy." Michael stared at her intensely, his green eyes revealing a vulnerability he rarely allowed to show. "You saw them from the first day, and somehow you saw me too." Sarah felt her heart accelerate. She knew exactly what he meant. In the last few weeks, something had changed between them. Small shared moments, a cup of tea late at night in the kitchen when everyone was already asleep, a prolonged conversation about the girl's progress that transformed into personal confidences, looks that lasted a little longer than necessary. Before she could respond, however, Emma waved from the garden. "Mom! Mr. Anderson! Come see! Madison just identified a monarch butterfly!" The moment of intimacy dissipated, but the vibration of those unspoken words remained between them as they descended the veranda steps together. That same afternoon, Sarah was checking the twins' physical therapy schedules for the following week when the doorbell rang. It was a quiet Saturday. They weren't expecting visitors, and most of the staff was off, except for the driver and two maids. Distracted by her thoughts, she headed to the main door, assuming it would be some delivery. Upon opening it, however, she felt the blood freeze in her veins. Before her, wearing a cheap suit and a predatory smile she knew too well, stood Robert Miller. "Surprise, my love," he said, the falsely sweet tone contrasting with the coldness of his eyes. "Aren't you going to invite your husband in?" Sarah gripped the door, as if it were a shield. How did you—" she stammered, unable to process the sight of the man she believed would be in prison for at least 5 more years. "Let's say I made some influential friends during my unwanted stay," he replied with a cynical smile. "And imagine my surprise when I discovered that my dear wife and my daughter are now living in the mansion of the famous Michael Anderson." "Ex-wife," corrected Sarah, recovering part of her composure. "Our divorce was finalized 10 years ago, Robert. You have no right to be here." Robert stepped forward, forcing his entry. Sarah instinctively backed away, an old fear resurging, her body remembering what it was like to be vulnerable before him. "Where's Emma?" he asked, looking around the imposing hall. "I'm sure she'll be thrilled to see the father she thought was dead, won't she?" The mention of Emma made Sarah regain her strength. She straightened her posture, facing her ex-husband's gaze. "You won't see her. I don't know how you managed to get out of prison, but I suggest you go back there before I call the police." Robert laughed, the empty and cold sound echoing through the hall. "Call the police and say what? That you lied to our daughter her entire life? That her husband, whom she believes died tragically, is actually a wanted criminal? What kind of trauma do you think that would cause, Sarah?" Sarah felt her stomach sink. He was using Emma as a weapon against her, as he always had. "What do you want, Robert?" "At the moment, just a civilized conversation," he replied, advancing further into the house. And later, well, I heard that Anderson's little daughters are the key to a considerable fortune. The horror of comprehension struck Sarah like lightning. It wasn't an accidental visit. It was a plan, and the twins were the target. "You won't touch them," she declared, her voice trembling with anger. "Leave now, or I'll scream." "Scream," challenged Robert, suddenly pulling a gun from the inside pocket of his jacket. "And we'll see who arrives first, help or the bullet." At that exact moment, the side door opened, and Emma entered, followed by Lily and Madison in their wheelchairs. The three froze at the scene, Sarah pale with fear, an armed stranger in the middle of the hall. "Mom!" called Emma, her voice trembling with confusion. Robert turned slowly, a smile forming as he saw his daughter for the first time in a decade. "Emma," he said, his voice artificially choked with emotion, "look at you all grown up." Sarah saw the absolute shock cross her daughter's face, followed by the purest disbelief. Who are you?" asked the teenager, although a beginning of understanding was already forming in her eyes. "I'm your father, dear. Robert Miller. I'm alive, as you can see." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could almost hear Emma's world crumbling, all the truth she had believed in shattering before her eyes. "My father is dead," Emma finally replied, her voice strangely firm. "He died. In an accident when I was 5 years old." Robert shook his head with false sadness. "Is that what your mother told you? What a convenient lie, don't you think? The truth, my daughter, is that I was unjustly imprisoned, and your mother, instead of supporting me, chose to erase my existence from your life." Emma's eyes turned to Sarah, full of silent questions and pain. "Mom, is it true?" Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. This was the moment she had feared for years, the truth exposed in the worst possible way. "Emma, Yes, it's true," Robert interrupted her. "Your mother preferred to say I was dead, rather than admit she married a man the system unjustly persecuted." Lily, who had been observing the scene in silence until then, moved her chair a few inches forward. "You're lying," she declared with the cutting frankness that was her trademark. "Your body language, the way your hand grips the gun. You're not a victim of the system. You're a predator." Robert seemed momentarily destabilized by the child's intervention, but soon recovered his composure. "How clever you are, little Anderson. That's why you and your little sister will be my special guests today." He pointed the gun directly at Sarah. "Now all of you are going to calmly accompany me to the car parked outside. No screams, no alarms, or Mommy here will be the first to bleed." The icy terror that ran through Sarah at that moment was not for herself, but for the three girls who were now at the mercy of a man capable of anything. "Robert, please," she begged. "They're just children. Leave them out of this." "Rich children," he corrected with a cruel smile. "Daughters of the man who can pay millions to have them back." It was at this moment that Madison, the quietest of the twins, the one who almost never spoke, discreetly pressed a button on the side of her chair, a small gesture that went unnoticed by Robert in his moment of triumph. Michael was in his office, reviewing documents for a new clinic that would be inaugurated the following month, when the red emergency light flashed on the discreet panel installed on his desk. It was a security system connected to the girls' chairs, a panic button that Jessica had insisted on installing years ago and that had never been activated until now. Abandoning everything, he ran to the main corridor, in time to see the hall through a partially open door, an armed man, Sarah pale, the frightened girls, with his heart hammering against his chest. Michael silently retreated and took out his cell phone. 3 calls later, one to the police, while speaking in whispers, he headed to the gun room, another remnant of a past in which his greatest concern was protecting the family against conventional assaults. In the hall, Robert was beginning to lead the group outside, Sarah in front, followed by Emma, who was pushing the twins' chairs. "Where are you taking us?" asked Lily, her voice firm despite the evident fear. "For a ride," replied Robert, the false smile never leaving his face. "Your daddy will receive instructions on how he can have his princesses back. As for you, Emma, well, it's time to spend some quality time with your real father." Emma remained silent, but her eyes met Sarah's, communicating something only the two of them understood. Years living with just each other had created a silent language between mother and daughter. When they reached the lawn that separated the house from the main gate, Sarah realized that the security guards were not at their usual posts. Robert had planned everything, or had an inside accomplice. "It won't work," she said, trying to buy time. "The police will be automatically alerted if the girls pass through the gate without authorization. The chairs have GPS." It was a lie, but Robert hesitated for a second, time enough for Emma, in a surprisingly quick movement, to push the twins' chairs in opposite directions, creating confusion. Robert cursed, pointing the gun now to one side, now to the other, momentarily disoriented. It was the instant Sarah needed to advance against him. What followed was chaotic. Sarah grabbed Robert's armed arm, struggling to divert the gun from any of the girls. Emma was screaming for help while trying to protect the twins. Lily, with impressive presence of mind, used the controls of her motorized chair to rapidly advance against Robert's legs, unbalancing him. A shot echoed through the garden, followed by screams. For a terrible moment, Sarah thought one of the girls had been hit, but it was Robert who staggered backward, blood staining the sleeve of his jacket. Michael was there, a few meters away, a gun firmly secured in his hands. His eyes, normally calm and controlled, burned with a primitive fury. "Step away from my family," he ordered, his voice colder and more dangerous than Sarah had ever heard. Robert, wounded but still armed, laughed bitterly. "Your family! How touching! The lonely millionaire, the dedicated nurse, and the broken children. What a perfect picture you form." Michael advanced another step, the gun unwavering in his hand. "Drop the gun. Now." Robert seemed to calculate his chances. His gaze jumped from Michael to Sarah, then to the girls, and finally to Emma, who was observing him not with fear, but with absolute repulsion. "You're not my father," she declared with surprising firmness. "My father died 10 years ago. You're just the man who donated the DNA." The words seemed to hit Robert more deeply than the shot in his arm. For a moment, something like genuine pain crossed his face. Then, in a sudden gesture, he turned the gun in Emma's direction. Sarah moved without thinking, throwing herself in front of her daughter at the exact moment Michael fired again. 2 shots sounded almost simultaneously. Robert fell heavily on the grass, hit in the chest. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, but remained standing, a human shield in front of her daughter. Sirens announced the arrival of the police, the sound growing in intensity while Michael ran to join them, dropping the gun to embrace first the twins and then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, pull Sarah and Emma into the same protective embrace. The following hours passed in a blur of ambulance lights, police questions, and emergency bandages. Sarah's wound, although painful, wasn't serious. The bullet just grazed her shoulder. Robert, on the other hand, was in critical condition, being transferred to a prison hospital under police surveillance. Sitting in the emergency room, with Emma holding her hand while a doctor finalized the dressing, Sarah felt as if she had lived several lives in a single day. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her daughter, tears finally escaping after hours of adrenaline and shock. "I should have told you the truth a long time ago." Emma squeezed her hand harder. "I knew, Mom, or at least I suspected. I found old newspaper clippings among your things a few years ago about his trial." Sarah stared at her astonished. "You knew all this time?" Emma nodded, her eyes revealing a maturity that transcended her 15 years. "And I understood why you lied. You were protecting me, As you always did. As you did today, throwing yourself in front of that bullet. The doctor discreetly moved away, giving them privacy in that intense moment. Aren't you angry? Hurt? Asked Sarah, almost afraid of the answer. Of course I was confused when I found out. Sad too. But never angry with you, Mum. How could I be? You sacrificed everything for me, built a life from scratch, alone, just so I could grow up away from his shadow. Sarah pulled her daughter into a tight hug, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. Nothing mattered more than that moment of truth and acceptance between them. The curtain of the emergency room opened softly. Michael was there, with Lily and Madison in their chairs beside him. The three looked exhausted, but there was something new in their gazes, a cohesion, as if they had finally found their way back to each other through the chaos of that day. "May we come in?" he asked, his voice gentle. Sarah nodded, wiping away tears. The twins advanced immediately, each holding one of her hands with concerned expressions. "You were so brave," whispered Madison, her rarely heard voice even more precious in that moment. "All of you were," corrected Michael, including Lily and Emma in his look of admiration. "And you?" He turned to Sarah, unable to find adequate words to express all he felt. "You saved my daughters." "We saved each other," replied Sarah softly. "That's what families do." The word hung in the air. Family. What had begun as a professional arrangement had transformed into something much deeper, forged not by blood, but by the daily choices of love and protection. 3 months later, the Anderson mansion was unrecognizable. The gardens, once meticulously arranged but rarely used, now housed an adapted skate ramp where Lily practiced maneuvers in her special sports chair. A small art studio had been built under a leafy tree where Madison, who had discovered a passion for painting, spent hours expressing in colors the feelings she still struggled to verbalize. Emma had officially become a monitor in a social project at Michael's clinics, where children with disabilities received not only medical treatment but also tutoring and vocational guidance. Her dream of studying law remained alive, now with a more specific direction, to specialize in the rights of people with disabilities. Sarah, completely recovered from her injury, had assumed a role that went far beyond caregiver. She now coordinated the humanization department of the Anderson clinics, implementing protocols that treated patients not just as medical cases, but as whole people with emotional and social needs. And Michael, perhaps his transformation was the most surprising. The man who previously lived for work, hiding from his pain in endless reports and meetings, now left the office promptly at 5 p.m., eager to return to the house that had finally become a home again. That Sunday afternoon, a small celebration was happening in the garden. It was Lily and Madison's birthday, 11 years celebrated, not with a grandiose and impersonal party like the one Michael had organized after Jessica's death, but with an intimate picnic, just the family and a few friends that the twins had made at the school they now attended. Sitting under the shade of a tree, Sarah observed the scene with a sense of fulfillment she had never imagined possible. Michael helping Lily serve the cake, while Madison animatedly explained to a friend the meaning of the colors in her new painting. Emma seated on the grass, playing guitar, a newly discovered talent she was sharing with her small circle of new friends. "A penny for your thoughts," said Michael, approaching to sit beside her. Sarah smiled, leaning slightly against his shoulder in a gesture that had become natural in recent months. "I was thinking about how unpredictable life is," she replied. "A year ago we were strangers, living in completely different worlds." Michael nodded, his eyes following the twins with the love he now allowed himself to openly demonstrate. "You know what Lily told me yesterday," he commented, a smile playing on his lips. "That she finally understands why Mommy always insisted we needed a complete family. Not because there was anything wrong with just the three of us, but because love multiplies when it's shared. Sarah felt tears forming. Jessica, even absent, is still present in the lessons she left for her daughters. She was a wise woman, she observed softly. Yes, she was, agreed Michael, taking Sarah's hand between his. And I'm sure she would approve of what we're building here. What they were building didn't have a name yet. It was too new, too fragile to be labeled. But it was real, born not from the idealized romance of fairy tales, but from something much deeper: mutual understanding, respect, and the daily choice to walk together through life's storms. Robert, recovered from his physical injuries, had been sentenced to another 20 years in prison for attempted kidnapping, invasion, and threat. His shadow, which for so long had hung over Sarah and Emma, was finally dissipating. "Mom! Michael! Come see the present the girls just opened!" called Emma, waving animatedly. They rose together, hands still intertwined, and walked toward the children. In the center of the circle, Lily and Madison proudly displayed a photo album that Emma had carefully assembled. Images from the last 6 months they had spent together, documenting not just special events but also everyday moments. Breakfast with everyone still in pajamas, Michael reading stories to the girls before bed, Sarah teaching Madison to make cupcakes, Lily and Emma competing in board games. The last page contained a recent photograph of the 5 of them, taken during a beach trip. Beneath it, written in Emma's elegant handwriting, a simple phrase: "The family we chose." "It's perfect," declared Lily, her usual challenging tone replaced by a rare softness. "It's the best present," agreed Madison, her voice still quiet but increasingly confident. Michael knelt between his daughters' chairs, embracing them with the emotional abandon that was once impossible for him. "The best present is having you," he said, his voice choked. "All of you," he added, looking at Sarah and Emma. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange tones that reminded Sarah of the beginning of that journey, the first sunset she had observed from that same veranda months ago, when she was still just a nurse hired to care for 2 difficult girls. Life had changed in ways she could never have predicted. The pain hadn't completely disappeared. There were still difficult days, nightmares, moments of insecurity. But now there was something stronger than pain, the certainty that they didn't need to face it alone. The twins' wheelchairs remained an immutable reality of their lives. The loss of Jessica would continue to be a wound that, although healed, would never completely disappear. The shadows of Sarah's past with Robert still occasionally visited her dreams. But none of these truths defined who they were or what they could become together. "Look!" exclaimed Madison suddenly, pointing to the sky. "A shooting star!" Everyone looked up, observing the luminous trail that cut across the firmament. For a moment they were silent, each lost in their own silent wishes. Sarah didn't need to close her eyes to make her wish. She looked around at that improvised and imperfect family she had found when she least expected it, and knew she already had everything she could wish for.